Hello and welcome to Dokupied, a podcast about anime, manga, light novels, and industry news. I'm your host, Brandon, otherwise known as DocPay. Let's jump right into the news section for this week. We got some more updates on various things delayed. The Crunchyroll Expo 2020 was cancelled. Assault Lily Bouquet anime was delayed to October. Dropout Idol Fruit Tart anime was delayed to October. And then we have a bunch of things that have been scheduled again after being delayed. Diary of Our Days at the Breakwater will restart on July 7th. PA Works Appare Ranman will restart on July 3rd. And then we have a couple series that were entirely pushed back that have been put back on the schedule. ReZero Season 2 will premiere on July 8th. My Teen Romantic Comedy Snafu Season 3 will premiere on July 9th. Monster Girl Dr. Anime will premiere on July 12th, and Sword Art Online Alicization War of the Underworld Part 2 will premiere on July 11th. So all those shows that got pushed back from this past season have now been, finished. I suppose their productions were able to complete in that extra time, and we'll be getting them starting for summer. So that's great news for fans of those series. In other news, Netflix is now streaming the Mirai anime film by Mamoru Hosoda. So if you haven't seen it, definitely go give that a watch. The BEM Reboot anime series is getting a movie this fall. And then we have a couple new license announcements. Manga Planet has licensed 2 new series. Butterfly Storage by author Ikori Ando, and The Flavors of Kumika by author Akihiro Ononaka. Additionally, J-Novel Club held a stream on Twitch to announce 3 new light novels and 2 manga licenses. We have When the Clock Strikes Z by Ichiro Sakaki, which is a name I'm sure any light novel fan recognizes. Very prolific author with lots of famous series. And they recently licensed another one of his works in the last licensing announcement. Then there's Monster Tamer by Minto Higure, and The Epic Tale of the Reincarnated Prince, Herscheric. Yeah, I'm definitely not saying that right, but it's by Nobiru Kusunoki. And then the 2 manga series they licensed were adaptations of light novels they're publishing. The first one is Bibliophile Princess, and the second one is The Tales of Marielle Cleric. So quite a quick news segment this week. But there's quite a bit of good news and things back on the anime schedule that I was looking forward to. Let's jump right into the recommendation for this episode. Here's your general spoiler warning. I'm not going to spoil any major plot points or character developments, but I will be talking in general about the following series. So if you haven't read it yet and you don't want to know absolutely anything at all about it, go read it and then come back and listen to this. But know that I'm not going to talk about anything that will spoil anything major for you. So the series I'm going to talk about is a light novel by the name of Altina the Sword Princess by Yukiya Murasaki. This author also writes How Not to Summon a Demon Lord, so you may have recognized them from that title. That had an anime adaptation that I actually quite enjoyed, surprisingly. And then I went on to start reading the light novels, which I like too. Both series are published by J-Novel Club. Makes it quite easy to keep track of and read. Altina has 4 volumes out as of last week, and the 5th volume is due out in August in ebook form. One reason that prompted me to talk about this series now was that, I recently read the 4th volume, and right now, J-Novel Club's June catch-up includes Altina. So if you are a member, you're able to read all 4 available volumes and all the parts now through June. So this is a great time to get in there and start reading this series. So I'll start off this recommendation by, comparing it to other series. I don't do this too frequently because I like to talk about series on their own merit, but Altina the Sword Princess is somewhat reminiscent of a couple other series that are out there. It has some archetypes that you'll recognize quite clearly. So for example, if you've read Realist Hero, or Economics of Prophecy, or The Genius Prince's Guide to Raising a Nation Out of Debt, or Isekai Rebuilding Project. Now, I know a lot of those, again, are also J-Novel Club, and some of them are more recent, less famous, but the point being, all of these series have something in common, which is that the main male lead is more of an intellectual, more so than anything else. These series may have fights, but the male lead in particular is more on the strategic, intellectual side. And so the plots are more largely focused on things like economy, or state building, politics, military maneuvering, machinations, things like that. And while there are fights and things like that in these series, it's more larger scale in general, armies against armies, or it's another character that's doing the fighting. So in the case of Altina, she is actually the one doing the fighting. So backing up one step, the main pair for this series is Altina, who is the fourth princess of this pseudo-European country in kind of a, this is definitely not Europe, but also definitely Europe kind of inspired setting. And Regis. Regis is part of the admin of the army, and so not on the fighting side whatsoever. He has absolutely no strength or skill with a blade or of anything like that. This series is set in, I don't want to say medieval, not Europe, but it's definitely in the time of like early guns, early rifles age, like early industrial revolution. And then Altina is the fourth princess of this nation, or empire rather. The story kind of starts on the fact that there is currently an ongoing power struggle between the first and second princes of this empire in who will succeed their father on the throne as emperor. Regis is recently sent to essentially the front lines in this, fort for reasons. They'll get into it and explain it, but he's sent out there, and that's where he meets Altina. Altina was also sent out there by her older brother, the second prince, to, well, basically just exile her and banish her out there and to keep her out of the political struggle in the capital. Not as a favor, but because he wants to win the throne. Altina essentially tries to get Regis to join on as her tactician, and she aims to win the throne for herself in an attempt to better the country. She sees the corruption, she sees the plight that the common peoples are going through because of their constant warring as an empire, the enrichment of the noble class and all that. So she sees it and she wants to try and do something about it, and she decides the only way to do that is to actually win the succession. And so she recruits Regis. That's the basic setup of the story, and there's a lot of other characters they introduce through the army and in the fort, in some other nations, and they get into some machinations with the other princes. But the plot is largely that Regis is helping Altina achieve her dream of becoming empress and bettering the empire. So putting kind of the setup aside, like I said, there are somewhat archetypal characters. Regis is the book-smart, lanky, completely non-physical type of main lead guy. He has absolutely no ability physically whatsoever, but he reads a lot of books, and he's pretty good at devising strategy and tactics based on things he's read, examples, and coming up with ways to outsmart the enemies. Altina, on the other hand, is like super strong. They explain it, but it's still kind of one of those magic. The world has no magic in it. This is a very grounded series in that way. There's no fantastical elements aside from some weird strength that some of the characters possess is unnatural in that respect, but you can chalk it up to kind of the embellishment of past peoples. Or like, oh, that person was, super duper strong. They were hitting, like, one swing of their club sent 10 men flying kind of thing. Whereas, they were just like pretty dang good. or like really awesome with their thing, but they were still within the realm of reality. This series, on the other hand, kind of takes that and makes it literal, where like Altina, being a kind of a young girl, is actually really fucking strong, like abnormally so. And they play it off that, you know, she trained hard and is a member of the descendants from like the first emperor, who is like known to be super strong and all that stuff. So that's kind of the only fantastical element, is that there are characters that are just like really fucking strong, but otherwise it's all very conventional and grounded in reality. The first 4 volumes cover what are essentially Altina's like initial growth into a leader. Not the 4th volume, but so the first 3 volumes generally cover her becoming a real candidate for Empress. The plot moves in various directions, and they accomplish some things, and they get into a conflict with the first and second princes, and generally speaking, it puts Altina in a position of power with support from various sides because of some things that happen, and so she becomes a real candidate. And then volume 4 actually takes us to another country, where we learn about the political situation there, and one of the other princes, who is not in the running, actually, but the 3rd prince, who is currently studying abroad, essentially, there, undercover. And so volume 4 actually takes a break from the conflict with Altina and goes over and talks about this other country that will become more important within the story as time goes on, and especially once in volume 5, there were some big plot developments at the end of 3 with this country. So they spent a whole volume fleshing out the situation there and explaining what's going on. And then in volume 5, we come back to our main pair, and the stories will link up there. Generally speaking, I think the characters in this story feel like they have good agency. They seem, while initially archetypal, to actually have their own like unique aspects and quirks. And I quite like the writing. Yukiya Murasaki has a style that lends itself well to like easy reading. It's not too complex of a story or plot, and the prose isn't either too overly complicated, but all that adds to why I like Altina. It's somewhat straightforward, but it's really well put together. The plot makes sense, the characters' actions make sense. I'm not frequently taken out of the story thinking, like, why would this character ever act this way or do this? Or this plot is unrealistic, it would never go this way. And that's one thing I really appreciate about this author in both stories that I've read, is that there's kind of a surprising level of insight into the characters and the story. And maybe not for Altina, but it's more surprising in How Not to Summon a Demon Lord, because I thought going into it that series was just all about tits and ass. Like, it's all a fan service series, and the whole purpose was that. Turns out not so true, and Altina in particular doesn't have that problem at all. They do dance around the concept of like romance between Regis and Altina, and it's largely downplayed by Regis saying like, yo, she's a princess and I'm a fucking no one, and so that's how it gets put in the background frequently. But it's definitely there. The makings of a bit of romance there exist. But a lot of the focus on the first 4 volumes is more character growth, getting Altina and Regis to recognize their faults and their problems through interacting with each other. You know, Regis is horribly self-deprecating, has absolutely no courage, and doesn't believe in himself whatsoever. Whereas Altina doesn't know how to stop and think before acting initially. She just jumps out and does stuff without a whole lot of forethought. And so they balance each other in that way. And as the story progresses, they both learn to start overcoming those problems through each other. Regis gains some confidence through, well, basically Altina believing in him. He believes in Altina, and she trusts him, and so he gains some confidence through that. Altina learns through Regis that she needs to actually consider what she's doing and how that'll impact things going forward, and what effect it'll have on the outcome she wants. And so she starts to take a breath, think about things, because she believes in Regis. So there's a really strong dynamic there between Regis and Altina that I really like. And I think it builds a really good core to the series where they play off each other really well. And you can see them growing across these first 4 volumes. Well, 3 really, because they're not really in the 4th volume. But across the first 3, you can see their relationship growing, the trust they have in each other growing. And even if they have disagreements about things, they're still pushing forward. And I really like that dynamic that they've created. And I think it lends well to the plot. While the plot may sound kind of normal in that, oh, there's a succession crisis in this empire where the emperor is allowing his kids to kind of vie for the position to be named as successor. And so there's all kinds of political and military machinations going on. But within that, there's a compelling story, I think, of Regis and Altina. I'm very curious and interested in where this series will go. There are currently 13 volumes in Japan, so we have quite a ways. But one thing I'm definitely grateful for, even this early in the series, is that they spent an entire volume, volume 4, and put aside the main pair to develop the situation in an entirely different country in the setting. They brought on all these new characters, a new conflict, and established what was going on kind of outside the scope of our main characters. And I really appreciate that when novels are able to do that successfully, when they can take a pace and step back and say, okay, there's this development happening, but we need to flesh this out. And so they spent the entire volume delving into these new characters central to that situation, building them up, going over what's going on, then linking that back up with the main story. And initially, you might think like, oh, that's going to take me out of it. Like, this whole volume doesn't have anyone I know about and doesn't have any of the characters I like, or I don't get to find out what happens next in kind of the main plot story. But because it is a novel, and you know there's more coming, and you know they will tie it back in, I can really appreciate when series do that. When they take the time to flesh out the world, do some additional world building and character building for people who are going to be, central to the story or the developments going forward. Each volume is actually quite short in length overall, so they really do kind of encapsulate the light portion of light novels, which is good. They're under 200 pages, so they're quite simple and easy to get through in a single sitting, but they have just enough plot and character development that you really don't feel like you didn't get enough. I do always want more, but that's unrelated to this series in particular. One other facet I wanted to discuss about this series is the world building. The setting is essentially not Europe. The empire that they are in is known as Bulgaria, and while there are obvious parallels to real-world stuff, otherwise the world isn't super fleshed out. They go over some of the political situation in the surrounding area, into a little bit of the history of the founding of this empire, and they explain kind of the current technological status of the world, where they're at the end of post-sword and shield kind of stuff, and at the start of steam technology and muskets and guns. So like I said, early industrial revolution. And so they don't have to go into a ton of detail, but there's definitely enough there that you get a firm sense of both the time and place for the story. I also wanted to quickly cover the romance part a bit again. So while I did say that there is some romance brewing between Regis and Altina, it's really not the focus, and I wouldn't recommend anyone read this series if romance is their primary interest. It's there, and it's starting to exist more, but it's not gonna be a thing. It's never really gonna be the major player in terms of what this story's about. It's far more largely focused on politics, military, and character moments and growth. More large-scale stuff. The romance, like I said, is there, but it's really not the focus whatsoever. So kind of all in all, I really do think, though, that this series is very straightforward. The plot is straightforward, but well written and justified. The characters might be somewhat stereotypical in their archetypes, but they all feel like they have proper motivations, they work towards their own goals, they seem to have appropriate agency. They're not paper thin. They may be the result of like an archetype that you recognize, but they're written a lot better than that. They come off like real characters who have proper motivations and goals that they strive towards. And in all the decisions they make, you can see that it's reflected in that. And so I really like that aspect of this author's writing. That even if it does have quite a bit of like straightforward plotting, straightforward kind of known character types, it's all executed really well. So while I'd hesitate to say this is some like amazing series, I really like it. It's something I really enjoy reading, it's quick, and it's always satisfying. It's hard for me not to recommend something that is done and put together this well. And you'll notice there's one word I didn't mention whatsoever. This series is not an isekai. It is purely fantasy. Well, it's not necessarily fantasy, but it's historical fantasy, if that makes maybe a little more sense. It is fantasy, but there aren't fantastical elements, so it's historical fantasy. And oftentimes, I wish a lot of isekai series that don't put their gimmick to use, where you wonder why at all in the first place did they make it an isekai? Why did they have someone reincarnate? They don't use that plot point at all. Some of them definitely use it far more skillfully, and it actually makes sense. But there are some where you're like, was that even necessary? You could have just written a straight up fantasy. I guess slapping the isekai genre on something instantly gives it a smidge more popularity or notice. I don't know, it's probably just a marketing tool. But anyway, Altina doesn't need it. It is not an isekai, and there's no reason it would ever need to be. And so I also really appreciate that part of it, where it's just a straight up story. There's no weird gimmicks. There's nothing at play here. It's just a straight up historical fantasy story. And I love how to the point, and I love how well crafted this particular story is. So I think I've rambled on enough in this recommendation, but there you have it. My recommendation for this episode is Altina the Sword Princess by Yukiya Murasaki, published by J Novel Club in English. There are 4 volumes currently available. The 5th one is due out in August and is currently being released on a simul-publishing schedule on J Novel's website for members, and it's part of the June Catch-Up series. So if you are a member, you can read all 4 volumes on their website right now. So I highly recommend you take this chance and get in there and just read it. I think that does me for this episode. Thanks for listening. Follow my Twitter, I am DocPay, for updates. Subscribe to Dokupied Podcast wherever you want. And please, if you like the podcast, leave a review. Or if you don't, let me know why. I always love reading listener feedback. I'll catch you next time.